Hello everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Shotijani Aminu Okoyemi, a graduate student from University Islam International Indonesia, Triple IU. I want to share with you today an insight on experimental research in pure science and in education. The overview of our discussions will focus on the meaning of experimental research. Then after that, types of experimental research, then experimental research in science, and what we refer to as experimental research in education. After that, I would like to look at the similarities between experimental research in science and experimental research in education. And lastly, we end our discussion by looking at differences between experimental research in science and experimental research in education. So, the meaning of an experimental research, according to Creswell 2012, an experimental research refers to a research which focuses on testing an idea to determine its effect on an outcome. This is according to Creswell 2012. An experimental research basically focuses on investigating the effect of changing one variable, independent variable, on another variable. So it actually focuses on finding or establishing the cause and effect relationship between two variables. Then what are the types of experimental research in education? We have basically two. The first is between group design experimental research, where we have about two groups, experimental group and control group. Then the second one is what we call within group experimental design. In this case, we have just only one group, but we can vary different kind of interventions at different time period for this particular group. So the next is experimental research in pure science and experimental research in education. For experimental research in pure sciences, we try to investigate natural phenomena through control experiments to establish cause and effect relationship. Example of this is testing the effect of light intensity on photosynthesis in plants by varying light levels. This is according to Smith and others, 2020. Likewise, in education, we have experimental research, which actually focuses on investigating the effect of change in educational variable, saying like learning process or teaching method on the academic performance of students. Example of this is testing the gamifying learning method versus traditional learning or teaching method on the academic performance of students. Then we have similarities between experimental research in science and experimental research in education. The first one, both experimental research in science and education focuses on establishing cause and effect relationships. Creswell 2023. Another similarity is an area of utilizing control conditions to minimize external influences. This is according to Cohen 2018. Another similarity between experimental research in science and education is that both tries to ensure replicability of validation for validation rather. And lastly, another similarity is that both try to make use of systematic data collections and analysis. And lastly, we look into differences between experimental research in science and experimental research in education. For the first one, in science, our experimental research is actually carried out in laboratory settings, while in education, experimental research is carried out in classroom settings. Another area of differences is that in science, experimental research tries to establish universal laws, while in education, experimental research focuses on improving learning process. Another area of differences is that in science, experimental research build on theoretical knowledge or establishes theoretical knowledge, while in education, experimentalists try to find practical solutions to educational issues. On this note, we come to the end of the insight for today. Thank you very much.